Hello, we're back for another episode of Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life, and I have a special guest today. I'm so excited to introduce you to a really wonderful friend of mine, somebody who we've been on a healing path, a healing journey here together for quite a while. So we've known each other for many years now. And this is Dr. Courtney Pare. And Courtney is a doctor of naturopathic medicine. And she's been working as really as a life coach for many years now because her practice led her to really working with people on multi levels and multi disciplines. So, like me, she's called herself a life coach because that's kind of a nice, don't you think that's just a nice way to describe ourselves? It's nice to have that title in today's
Hmm.
world, isn't it? It's easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think for you, I mean, I know doctor can be intimidating for some people, I'm sure. So, to
Hmm.
have like kind of that multi-title effect is a nice way to just kind of soften, beginning with clients and trying to introduce the work. And so Courtney's here to talk with me about beautiful work, beautiful life. And she and I both know that the beautiful work doesn't start out beautiful. It can be really ugly, as we've said before on this podcast many a time. It's hard work and it's not always pretty, but it's the path really to feeling more beautiful and feeling like you can build a beautiful life. So we're happy to share today. And our topic today for our listeners is I hope is going to be one that really touches a lot of people's lives and hearts. And it's about sharing your truth, which in today's world is quite tricky, is it not, Courtney?
Very tricky. Very tricky. Not
Mhm.
only figuring out what is my truth, but then how to share my truth in a way that's really aligned with our values. Certainly, I know that in our work together, that's something I've been working through. So, yeah, I think it's certainly a challenging topic today.
Yeah. Now, Courtney and I both, I think, consider ourselves sensitives and intuitives. And our path to discovering that, has been, I think, I know for me, it was through this work. I feel like I started to understand it a little bit when I was in therapy. I feel like I really began to understand it even more once I started working with people and started to use that sensitivity more as a skill than as a burden that I always carried it as. Do you find that
Hmm.
that's the same for you too, Courtney?
Yes, yes, definitely. I think what, like you're saying, I always thought maybe there was something wrong with me, that I was too sensitive, and then being able to see that shift, like you're saying, from a burden to a gift in a way that I feel like it helps me connect with others, particularly clients, in such a profound and unique way, has been really neat to see that shift from like something heavy to carry to something to create more lightness. So it's been
Yeah.
neat.
Yeah. And I know. So Courtney and I'll share a little bit about our stories, but for both of us, we grew up in families where it was really hard for us to share our truth. And I think part of that had to do with, I know for me, part of it had to do with feeling like I looked around in my family and I felt like people weren't getting me. And when I started to talk more about what I saw as reality or what I felt was my truth, that it was met with a lot of, I would say, emptiness rather than any kind of encouragement to talk about it more or more sharing. And so, for both of us, the path to sharing our truth has not been an easy or necessarily a short path. For me, it's been a long journey, and I continue that journey to really feel like I'm constantly in alignment with my truth, able to share it, able to express it in a way that I feel good about afterwards. Because I think that's one of the trickiest parts about this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, huh?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it. I know for me, it's similar to what you're sharing there. It was like, first of all, it was figuring out, wait, what is my truth? Because I know when I would start to get an idea of what my truth was and then talk about that in my family in particular, I was met with opposition. And so then I would talk about it often, like I felt confused, but I think this is it, but you're telling me it's something different. And so that made it harder for me to start to really share my truth because one example that I keep thinking of when I was very little, parents would just tell me, oh, you're just shy. You just don't like to be around people. And I kept thinking, well, I do like to be around people, but I was anxious. But they kept telling you just don't like to be around people, and to this day, they'll still tell me that, like, oh, you're just shy or you're just an introvert, and it's like I'm trying to tell them who I am or how I feel, and they'll tell me, oh, that's not who you are. And so, at a core level, it makes sense now as to why, from when I was very little, I was kind of unsure of what my truth was because I was being told what my truth was rather than tuning into what my truth was.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that too, that identification, of the confusion around whether you like to be around people and whether you're shy or not. Because I do think that as a sensitive person, sometimes it's hard for us to be around people. It doesn't mean that we don't want to be around people,
Hmm.
but sometimes we have a hard time depending on what the context and what the who the people are that we're with. I know. I think what I've come to learn about myself is I'm outgoing in situations where I'm really comfortable, but I'm
Hmm.
a total introvert in every other situation.
Likewise. Yes.
Yeah. Which is really interesting. I mean, that's an interesting
Hmm.
combination of things, and I think that really reflects how important it is to to be able to take into consideration who you're with and what your environment is, especially when you're sharing your truth. So let's
Yes.
talk about that a little bit as maybe the beginning for our listeners to help them sort through how do we share our truth and what's a good way to do it and how to go about that and all that. And I think the beginning is having somebody who knows how to listen well. Don't you feel like
Hmm.
that's key to be able
Hmm.
to share your truth well?
Yes, absolutely. I think, like you're saying too, the truth can be so nuanced, especially as you're navigating through it in the beginning. That I think the if you're cut off or you're met with some other anything other than someone just compassionately and openly listening to you, that can any truth that's starting to come out, and at least I know for me, if it's not met with compassion on the other side or acceptance on the other side, very quickly it can be suppressed back down and sit there for however much longer. Like, oh wait, it's not safe to share my truth now. So definitely someone. I think too, a quote that I heard once, or something that I heard once was, there's a big difference between listening to understand or listening to kind of receive and listening to respond. And I do think
Yes.
that that's a lot in today's society too. We're listening to respond. Like, oh, well, they said this, I'm going to respond with this. And I find it's easier to share your truth when someone's just listening to receive, just listening to understand, just truly listening to hear you out. So I do think that makes a big difference.
Wow, that's beautiful. I love that you put it and laid that out so nicely for our listeners to hear because it's hard to um, it's hard to share your truth when the energy of where your words are going is not like an open space to be received into, and instead it's kind of like I know for me, like I can usually tell by the look on somebody's face if they're already in their head thinking about what they're going to say,
Yes.
right? And so between body language and the energy, like there's a lot of subtle cues that give us a sense of whether we're being really received or not. And
Hmm.
that's the part where that's how we learn to trust ourselves too. We did
Yes.
a podcast on self trust in October. And so I would encourage people to go back and listen to that because this idea of being able to trust yourself to know when to share your truth can sometimes be a little tricky
Hmm.
to know, right?
Yes, definitely. I think sharing your truth is a really vulnerable act. So, like you're saying, if you're speaking to someone who seems distracted or they're not really listening, the space doesn't seem kind of as safe or as welcoming to open up and to be really vulnerable about that. And I know for me on both ends, whether I'm the one sharing my truth or if I'm the one receiving someone's truth, it goes there's much more depth to it when I'm not distracted, when if someone's sharing with me, or if I'm like, oh, wait, I need to respond to that, and I have to take a step back sometimes too to be, wait a minute, what is my role here? They're not asking me for advice. They're not, looking to me to solve this. I'm just here to listen. And I know when I'm on the receiving end, if I truly can just get in that space of listening, I think it encourages other people to share their truth a lot more. So when I'm on the other end and I'm sharing my truth, I try to remember that as well, because I do think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I do too. For me, I learned about being received really well in group process when I was doing peer leadership training back in my 30s before I did my master's work. That was kind of my early place of really um, being heard and witnessed in a way where I knew I was being fully received, and to be in a group space where one of our agreements in the group was that there was no cross talking and there was no responding to anybody. Really, we were just holding space to be heard, to witness and to listen and to give good loving attention. And man, that was my turnaround time around like really being able to like open up and speak into my truth and learn how to do that comfortably, even though it was so uncomfortable. It took a long time to get to that comfort level, you know?
Yes, I love that. That's a beautiful reminder too. I think for me, very similarly, and it was with you. It was, I think actually I'd been in therapy and group work prior to working with you, but when I joined, kind of a master group mastermind that you were offering,
Mm.
and I remember being really uncomfortable at first. I was still kind of nervous around people, and then everyone had the same amount of time, really like floor time, so to speak, air time, and I think in my first time around, I was just crying. I think the whole time I couldn't even get any words out, but there was something really powerful and connecting, even when I wasn't saying anything, just having people truly hold that space. So I agree with that. That's a great reminder because I had forgotten about that. That was a big turning point for me too, to realize, like, yeah, just compassionately holding space for someone makes a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. So these are skills that anybody can learn, and
Hmm.
anybody can ask others to learn in their lives. But I think that it's the kind of thing that truly you have to seek out. I think that you don't necessarily run into people in the day to day world. I
Hmm.
mean, sometimes we meet people that happen to have some of these natural skills from family life or academic experiences, or just happen to be in environments where they had those experiences and they adopted some of that skill. But I think that in the world today, generally speaking, it's just not out there run of the mill spaces where you're heard and really listened to so that you feel like you can comfortably speak your truth and
Yeah.
and not worry about what's coming back at you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think it's one thing to have the mindset of, I'm just going to speak my truth and I'm not going to care. I'm just going to go out there and speak it. But it's very different when you're in an environment where people don't have that same mindset or aren't open to you sharing your truth. And so definitely I think it's seeking out people on a similar path or who are trying to work and build similar skills. Because I think that there's uh, it might not always be safe to share your truth, or and I think that's thing too of like safe spaces. I see this on social media a lot too of like, this is a safe
Mm,
space, and I think people throw around a safe space to share, but it's, what does a safe space really mean? And I mean, I think that's different for everyone, and I encourage people to think of that, like, what does truly make you feel comfortable, make you feel safe to share your truth? Because I know I've been in groups or on chats or something where everyone's like, this is a safe space, and I'm like, well, what makes it a safe space? Like, I can't
yeah.
just take you for your word, because as soon as I start to share, I'm shut down or I'm talked over or I'm dismissed or minimized. And so to me, it's like, this doesn't feel like a safe space at all. So I think saying something's a safe space and actually creating a safe space are two very different things.
Yeah, and I think that that takes some special training. I don't think
Mhm.
everybody necessarily, they might think they're creating safe space, but they might not necessarily be creating safe
Yeah.
space. And that comes back to trusting ourselves to know whether we feel like we can be vulnerable. And I think social media in a lot of ways probably has done us a disservice in
Hmm.
this arena that we're talking about, because I think we're all even confused about what does it even mean to share your truth, right? So
Hmm.
let's get back to that, because I feel like sharing our truth is really sharing our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions, our ideas, our hopes, our dreams, the knowledge maybe that we've acquired, the wisdom we may have from experience, and it's very much spoken in I statements.
Hmm.
It's truly when somebody's speaking into their truth and holding it as this is my truth, they're using I statements, they're using we statements or you statements, which is one of the, again, one of the agreements that we used in the Women's Center when we learned that model, was because the cultural pattern is often to just use we or you instead of saying I and owning, like empowering yourself to say, no, this is what I believe. This is what
Hmm.
I think, right? And I think that we're all a little bit confused in that way, don't you? Because everybody's just kind of throwing stuff out there so constantly, and
Yeah.
we don't
Yeah.
really even know what to think or believe, or
Yeah.
who what where'd they get that fact, and all this fact checking that's
Yeah.
going on. It's a confusing time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to that point too, I think when people are sharing their truth, people who I guess are maybe surface level sharing their truth, they're sharing the truth with the agenda or the hope to change someone else's truth or to change someone's mind and to persuade them. I see that a lot. And,
Yeah.
a relationship course that I took once, training, The leader was talking about there is no, one objective truth, right? That it two people can have two different truths and then both be very true. And I think especially in like a social media realm, it's people are sharing a truth and trying to throw evidence and reasons and all this stuff to convince somebody else. And I think that's what makes it tricky. Like, well, I was believing this, but now is that wrong? And then we start to not trust ourselves. And so we can't trust ourselves. We can't really share our truth. And so I think, yeah, again, it goes back to that intention of your truth can still be your truth, even if someone else doesn't agree with it. Like, it doesn't mean they're wrong. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just two people can have two very different truths, but then be the truth for them.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we go back to that idea of what your truth is, So if I say I feel angry about something, that might be the truth of what I'm experiencing right now. It's so much
Yeah.
of this language and really being able to like get more articulate about what we're saying. I think I remember saying to you, you know what I mean? Like that's a thought in my
Yeah.
mind. I think I remember it, right? Versus like uh, my opinion of something that's happening in the world
Yeah.
today is that this is right or this is wrong or this is better or this should be this way. And those are all opinions, but they're the truth of what we think and we feel inside ourselves. And so that's the other thing, is like our opinion is not the truth or any,
Hmm.
it's just what we are thinking and feeling
Yeah.
and our ideas in our own mind. And I
Yeah.
think we're we stumble, a lot in the
Yeah.
sharing. And so let's
Yeah.
come back to this idea of vulnerability, Courtney, because I feel like it's so true, like that idea of, when we're sharing vulnerably on social media, like coming back to what's our intention
Hmm.
behind that, right?
Yes.
And social media shouldn't be a place where we're doing our healing work, right? It can
Hmm.
be a place where we give voice to some of what we're learning or experiencing, but to go there with the intention, like, I'm going to heal by putting this out on social media is often, asking for some rewounding rather than
Hmm.
healing to happen out there. So
Yeah.
what do
Yeah.
you experience? How are you finding that for you as you go through social media? Like what's your vibe these days with all of that?
Yeah. Well, I think too, getting back to the kind of what we're talking about and sharing your truth, I feel like sharing your truth is a very almost like internal, intimate process. And we think of social media, at least when I think of social media, it's not really intimate at all, right? You're putting it out
Right.
there for any and all of these people to
Yeah.
receive. And I see it as it's coming, or at least kind of the vibe I get around it is that people, even if they are being vulnerable, and now, of course, this isn't everyone, but a large majority, it's like there's a hidden agenda behind it, like almost like, oh well, I need to be vulnerable here to be relatable, or if I share this then I will fit in. And to kind of like our topic of sharing your truth, I feel like that pulls us further away from sharing our truth because we're getting away from self and again trying to fit in with what am I supposed to be doing, what do people expect of me, how can I fit in here. And when we're coming at it from that mindset, at least for me, it's like I start to lose my truth a little. And it's like, oh, well, I'll bend it here because I think this person will like it, or I'll bend it here because I think I'll fit in here. And so if you're coming to social media truly to share your truth, I think that's very different. Like being vulnerable in that sense is very different than I will share this with the expectation that it will go this way. I think people share certain stuff with an expectation that it's going to go a certain way. And I think that can kind of dilute your truth in some way because sometimes the most vulnerable thing you can do is not share at all. Like not kind of go with the flow because it's like, oh, you know what, this is how I'm feeling and I'm not going to share that. We don't have to share everything. And I think that coming
Yeah.
back to your truth of why am I sharing this? Does this feel aligned with myself right now to share, or am I sharing this because I feel like I should, or I'm going to be missing out on something if I don't share? And to me, that again, it's a delicate balance to kind of go between. But to me, I know I've certainly felt like, oh, I should share this because this is what people expect of me. But it's like, well, then is that really my truth in that moment? And I think to what you were saying earlier, knowing your truth can kind of change. Your truth doesn't always have to remain exactly the same. I know I get caught up in that, like, but who am I at my core? What is my one truth? And we can have different ideas and different opinions and different truths depending on circumstances. So I think that's another thing with social media. It's like stay on your brand, or like you have to pick a side and stick to it. And I think normalizing changing your mind and having different ideas would go a long way for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that. let's give that out as like a permission slip on the
Yeah.
show today. I'm just saying, you have a permission to change your mind. You have a permission to
Yes.
keep things private too. I think,
Hmm.
I know that this is a topic that I've talked a lot with clients about, is the idea of the difference between privacy and holding secrets, right? And so
Hmm.
secrets oftentimes feel like they have power over us and maybe other people involved. And so now there's power struggles around secrets, and it can be a very messy kind of experience. Where privacy to me is, that you have some parts of you or parts of your life that you just choose to not share with other people or with the public or whatever. And that each of us is entitled to that. And I think in the political world, because things have become so public, people's personal lives become so publicized and sought after, looking for messy information, it's,
Hmm.
it's become a hard place to say it's okay to have a private part of your life.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
parts of you that you can just keep quiet if you choose.
Yeah. I
Mm,
love that. And I think, too, going back to the truth piece of that, think at least I know that I do this and I've heard it from clients, is almost they feel like they have to put it out there, or it has to be validated by someone to be true, right? Well, this is how I'm
right.
feeling. And so I need someone. And that's not necessarily true. Validation can feel good at times, and it's certainly beneficial at certain times, but your truth gets to be your truth, whether everyone or nobody knows about it, or if everyone or nobody else agrees with it. I think that's where it comes, like you were saying, the self trust piece of this is my truth. And of course, as humans, it's wonderful to get support and validation, but it's, can I be okay with that being my truth, even if I don't get that support and that validation? And coming at it from a social media perspective, this is something I remind myself all of the time when I'm on social media, because I can certainly get caught up in like, oh, look at their life and look at them. And I need to say this, or otherwise it's not happening. People won't know about it. And it's like, just because it's not, you don't see it on social media doesn't mean it's not happening in the real world. And just because you do see it on social media doesn't mean it is happening in the real world. And I think when we're thinking of our truth and whatnot, it's like you don't have to share with people you don't want to. And even if you don't share, it doesn't mean it's not happening. And if you want to share, again, of course you can, but I think we get caught up on like, well, I didn't tell anyone about this, so maybe they don't realize this what's going on. But I think a lot of it comes down to self validation.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I agree. And I think that also, what are people, again, the intentions behind it, and why are we sharing what we're sharing? And I think that a lot of people in today's world need more spaces to have safe places to share and be heard, where they can actually heal from these small and large emotional traumas that many of us have been through. And social media is just, to me, it's just not the place to do that. It can
Yeah.
be a place of encouraging or finding places where you might be able to do that, but to think that that's going to come from the social media experience is not I don't think that's a it's not a good place to go in and have an expectation around that.
Yeah.
So let's come back to like this, creating spaces where it is okay, and we can share our truth, right?
Hmm.
For many of us who grew up in families where there was dysfunction or mental health issues, this can be a really tricky thing, can it? And we can carry over into your adult life later, until you find out and have some experiences of what it's like to share your truth and be witnessed and heard in a truly safe place where you
Hmm.
can be vulnerable. So, one of the things that we want to talk about, when we've talked a little bit about, is this idea of listening and getting a
Hmm.
sense of whether somebody's really receiving you, right? So let's see, what else can we say about that, Courtney? Let's see if we can just kind of reel off a few things. What else comes up for you around sharing your truth, and kind of where's a safe space to do that? What would we be looking for?
Yeah. Well, I think in relationships where it almost is, it's not safe to have conflict necessary, but yeah, like you can work through disagreements, you can work through conflict with ease and with love and with gentleness, I think, because it's sharing your truth again might trigger somebody else or bring something up within them. And sometimes sharing our truth, even with people we really love or relationships that we really value, sometimes the truth sometimes can be painful or triggering to someone else, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't share it. And I think it's not that you shouldn't share your truth if someone's upset about it, but it's seeking out or knowing the relationships where it's safe to disagree, where it's safe to have conflict and and work through it, because it's not about the absence of conflict that really creates healthy relationships. It's how you move through conflict and how you resolve conflict that really makes a big difference. So I think for me that's important, and sharing my truth is, if this person doesn't agree with me, is that okay? Is that safe? Because if it doesn't feel safe, I'm not going to risk sharing my truth and risk having a disagreement, because that wouldn't feel safe to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we grow that kind of relationship and those kinds of experiences of learning how to work through conflict, going from small things usually to the larger things, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the beautiful, you know, processes of growing a healthy relationship. And you work with people on relationship stuff all the time. So like this is like when we're trying to figure out how to address conflict, starting with small stuff is sometimes the easier way. And you can start to look
Mhm.
at what does your process actually look like, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And start to fine tune that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, an exercise that I have like clients do sometimes, like, along what you're saying, of just the simplest things is, oftentimes people who I work with who struggle with sharing their truth, they tend to be people pleasers, right? Or they kind of go with the flow, and it little things of just, if you automatically start to say like, oh, I don't know, if someone asks you a question, what do you want for dinner, or where do you want to go here? Oh, I don't know, whatever you want. We're already self-abandoning. It's like you're not even giving yourself a chance to think, what do I really want? We're assuming this person might not like what I say, so I'm not going to say it at all. So that can be a really simple step for people to start, like small, right? It's not high stakes where someone asks, where do you want to eat for dinner? Like actually check in with yourself and just suggest where you want to eat. Maybe they want to eat there too, maybe they don't, but it's like a little thing that it's not a big deal to disagree on. But if you haven't practiced that, it might feel like, oh, I said I wanted to eat here and they don't. And it could, I know it's like, oh no, did I say the wrong thing? But that's so you can practice very gently and small, like small steps toward owning your truth for bigger things. If it's starting with little things like that, like you were talking about.
And I love that, Courtney, because you think back to my trajectory of, my early relationships in my life where things didn't go that well and I wasn't sharing my
Hmm.
truth. And I think that, when I think back to that time in my life that I ended up, abandoning myself enough times and even just those small desires, right? And then over time would start to feel resentful because we were never doing what I wanted, or we were never
Yes.
having what I wanted, or it was never my turn to be the one to say, but I was never saying either. So it can
Yes.
start to take a trajectory that gets deeper, and then you have feelings, and we dig ourselves our own little hole sometimes that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Such a good point. Yeah, that resentment that often comes. Certainly, sometimes it is toward other people, but oftentimes it's within ourselves. We're not using our voice. We're not standing in our power. We're not sharing our truth, and then um, it's like we're getting mad at people for not meeting needs that we never told them that we had.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so talking about what we want, sometimes sharing that truth is tricky, right?
Hmm.
Especially if we're not used to doing it.
Yes.
It can become really difficult. I love journaling for this. When we talk about like being able to identify what we want, I think journaling is such a great place to start with
Yeah.
ourselves, right? Especially if
Yes.
we know, like I know when I started this work at the beginning, I didn't even know if somebody asked me what I wanted, I'd be like, I don't know. I
Yes.
think I know, but do I really know? And then I'd be afraid to say, and, you know, and so, a journal is such a safe place to put that,
Yes.
Yeah.
I think a prompt along that too, that um I don't use nearly as much as I could. Every time I remember this, I'm like, oh, I should do this more often, because it's definitely something that I still struggle with. But something that I like to ask myself, is, if something is coming up and it's like I have to make a decision one way or the other. And my go to is I don't know. It Journaling on, like, if I knew the outcome were going to go exactly as I wanted it to, if I knew this relationship would still be safe, if I knew whatever choice I made, whatever decision, whatever anything that I said was going to be met with love, acceptance, what would I really want to say? Because almost like, and then I can get a little bit more clarity on what I really want. Because I think, again, if we've been doing this for so long, our brain automatically, like, or at least I know for me, I just start to think like, oh, well, I don't think I want to go there. But it's like, I don't even know. I'm just assuming that's the safest option to choose. So that's what I think this person wants me to say. But if I can kind of strip all of that back and just hypothetically think, any answer is equal, like any answer is okay, what would I want to choose? And sometimes that can bring a little bit more clarity on at least what my truth is. I have, because again, it starts with, I have to know what my truth is before I can start to share my truth.
Yeah. Oh, Courtney, I love that. So I'm going to just, we'll be wrapping up before too long. And so I'm going to just offer that up. Usually at the end of the podcast, we offer up some ideas for our listeners to begin their own beautiful work and explore the topic a little bit. So I'm going to offer them up if you're okay with that, just like that exercise. I think that exercise
Hmm.
is so great. Pick something in your life that you're really struggling with or something that you're feeling confused about or whatever, and do that what if, right? If the scenario
Hmm.
worked out perfectly, and let's say the things you're worried about didn't come to pass at all, and instead it
Hmm.
was just met with non-resistance or whatever. What would you want, and
Yeah.
what would you want to do, right? That's a
Hmm.
beautiful way to look at that. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. So listeners, that's a great exercise for everybody. So we have kind of the listening aspect, being in a safe place. I think, one of the things that comes up for me too is growing your vulnerability slowly. Like just like we were talking about, starting with the small things or the small wants.
Hmm.
It's like starting to share yourself in small ways in a relationship. It's almost like a little testing ground to see how it's received
Yes.
and how somebody treats it with respect, or with honor, or whatever it is that you're looking for, right? It's a way to begin to start to grow your sense of the trust and the safety of the relationship itself.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's kind of being selectively vulnerable as well, instead of
Mhm.
feeling like, oh, I have to be vulnerable here, and I have to share everything here, and knowing that you can share different levels of your truth
Yeah.
with different people and in different circumstances. And that's something, again, I like to remind myself of, and I could remind myself of more of. Sometimes I'm compulsively honest, and it's like, well, if I don't share the whole truth, I'm not sharing my truth. But it's like sharing a part of your truth in a certain circumstance is still sharing your truth. You don't have to share every single detail about your life for it to be your truth. And so yeah, knowing that if you choose a little bit here and a little bit there, it doesn't mean it's not your truth. It's just you're reading your environment. You're, like you said, testing the waters to see how well it's received.
Mhm.
So like oversharing sometimes can isn't necessarily vulnerable and might not be your truth. It might be more of like a trauma response or your trigger. Like, I have to share all of this to see if they'll accept me. Where it's like, wait a minute, let me go back, get into like myself of, do I want to share this versus do I feel like I should or I have to share this?
Yeah. And I think that coming back to the topic of triggers, because we didn't really get into that, and we're not going to get into it deeply on this podcast. We will come back and talk about it another time. But this idea of when we're in relationship with somebody and when we're having a conversation and suddenly, we're sharing our truth and the other person isn't responding well. And then now all of a sudden we feel like we're triggered. So triggered is when somebody feels like they're no longer necessarily consciously in control of how they're responding to you, that there's some emotional aspect that doesn't seem necessarily related to the exact thing that's happening in that moment. And we usually know when we're triggered because we usually can feel it when somebody else is, and we can feel it when we are ourselves. And so, one of the things about sharing our truth that I would say for our listeners is, being careful of walking very tenderly around when we get triggered and when somebody else is get triggered. And usually when two people are getting triggered, nothing productive is going to come of it
Hmm.
unless we separate a little bit, or we change the conversation and talk about how we got triggered and what that's all about, and diffuse the emotion of whatever the trigger was. So for those listeners that are thinking, oh, I can never have such and such conversation with somebody around something I really want to talk about, and I want to talk about this truth, it's usually that there's some triggering going on. And I think that's a lot of what we struggle with in the world today is,
Hmm.
this whole idea of we want to have these conversations politically, or around race, around our feelings about all these big wounds, really culturally.
Hmm.
And many of us are just being triggered. And
Hmm.
so we're not having real conversations
Right.
that can be healing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like two wounded childlike states that are coming at one another rather than two rational adults. And I think that, and the more that you can become aware of that and recognize when you're shifting out of like rational adult brain into childlike, triggered child brain, can be really helpful. And then that That's where adult timeouts, I think, come in really handy. It's hard to remember that in the moment, but in couples work and relationship work in general, like adult timeouts are wonderful. As soon as you notice, you're aware that you're triggered or someone else is triggered, you call a timeout, you step away, and can actually be really healthy to do that rather than just going at one another. Because at that point, like you're saying, you're not coming at it from your highest self. You're not no longer speaking at it from your truth, because your truth resides in your more like highest aligned self. And so you're coming at it from a very wounded space. So yeah, taking a timeout when you can, if you can recognize it, I think goes a long way.
Yeah. And that's a great reminder too, Courtney, around that where your truth resides is usually like deep in your being, in your heart. It's kind of it runs along the core of yourself. And when we're really emotional, it's oftentimes that we're talking about the truth of our emotional experience rather than a real truth
Yeah.
that's beyond that. And so we want to again be able to talk about all of the above, not just
Yeah.
get focused on you're not listening to my truth. Well, right
Yeah.
now I'm caught up with I'm scared because you're seem so afraid. You're like you're frightening me
Yeah.
because you're so emotional, and so we get off of the whole experience. So I
Yeah.
think that's another for our listeners. When we're in really big emotional experiences, oftentimes we aren't thinking clearly and we aren't speaking really clearly. So to diffuse the emotion is a really important part of the process itself too. Yeah.
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 Great.
Well, Courtney, I feel like we could talk for days on this. Anything else coming up for you before we close out for this one particular time? Anything like kind of popping that
I
you know,
don't
we
I
touched
don't
on?
think so. I think
Yeah.
kind of that what you just closed it up on really resonated again. I think it's just remembering your truth there's different depths to your truth too. And
Yeah.
that sometimes it's self-validation that really will be what you need to validate your own truth. And then sometimes it is sharing your truth with someone else or, having a conversation about it. But I know for me it's helpful to remember that they're all my truth, except it's
Mhm.
just that sometimes it's like which level is it kind of residing at? Is it like present day I'm triggered and this is my truth versus is this like me at my core and my being? And to me, it's like they're all important and they all deserve validation, but I want to kind of go to bat for my core truth a lot more than to kind of my just triggered space truth.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that one thing I don't think we actually use this word, and we might have kind of alluded to it, but I think it's a good thing to say actually out loud is if you feel like you're being judged, it's also
Yes,
usually doesn't feel like a safe space to start to
yes,
speak your truth. Or you have to feel really solid in your truth. It wouldn't be a space where you'd share tender truth, maybe. It would be a place where you feel very strongly and very comfortable in your own truth, and that somebody could challenge you or judge it,
hmm
and you would feel okay because it's just your truth that
yes,
you're talking about, and so you
yeah,
could have a conversation around all of that, right? But
yes,
if you're feeling like you're it's a tender space, right?
hmm
Not want to share in spaces. So I would say that's a great exercise for our listeners. If you want to explore this topic a little bit more and you're thinking about, you don't feel like you're being heard well or whatever, kind of do that bullseye that we've talked about before in podcasts around relationships, and make a list of who do you have in your life where you don't feel judged, right? And sometimes those are the safest places to begin to start to share your truth and
yes,
do a little bit of healing work. But this whole idea of sharing our truth in the world today, I think, is a really big topic. Maybe we'll come back and do a part two on this, huh, Courtney?
yeah,
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for being with me today. I really
yeah.
appreciate
Thanks
it. I
for
loved
having
having our
me. This is great.
conversation. Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah. Good. All right, listeners, we'll be back for more real soon. Thanks for being with us today. Bye for
Thank
now.
you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Courtney. Bye.